So when Robert Blake Byass imported the first barrels of this wine to England, it made quite an impression. Hello and welcome to My Tiny Bottles, the project where I'm exploring my grandmother's legacy of miniature liquor bottles, one tiny bottle at a time. I'm your host, Tammy Coxon. Bottle number 94 is Tio Pepe Very Dry Sherry from González Byass, and it's one of the most famous sherry brands in the world. The story of Tio Pepe started in Spain in 1835, when 23-year-old Manuel María González Ángel decided he'd start a wine business. The only trouble was, he didn't know much about wine. Luckily for him, he had an uncle who did. González enlisted his Tio Pepe, whose real name was José María Ángel Vargas, to teach him all his secrets. He also gave his uncle a corner of the winery to call his own, and that was where Tio Pepe developed the wine that would go on to bear his nickname. González's business was a success, and within a few years he'd teamed up with a British merchant named Robert Blake Byass, and the two eventually formed the González Byass Company that still produces Tio Pepe and other wines. Today, we have some very specific definitions about what it means to be sherry, but for a long time it just meant wine from Jerez. It's been a good region for growing grapes for a couple of millennia, and its wines became very popular and were shipped all around the world. As early as the 1100s, sherry wines were being exported to Britain. They weren't sherry as we know it today, though. They did have one thing in common, which is that they were fortified with a little brandy to keep them from spoiling. This wasn't unique to the Jerez region, but eventually it would become one of the defining characteristics of sherry. If you want all the details about how that happened, check out the episode description for a link to a great article about sherry history. Sherry happens to be something that I love a lot, but it also happens to be the most confusing type of wine in existence, mostly because it's not just one style, but lots of styles, all called sherry. I teach an entire cocktail class all about sherry. I have graphs and flowcharts to explain it. I don't have time to cover all that here, but you need to know a little bit to understand why Tio Pepe made such a splash when it was released. By the 1840s, the British were in love with sherry. The sherry they were drinking was like the stereotypical sherry. It was fortified to be higher in alcohol, oxidized so it had a brown color and nutty flavor, and in many cases sweetened to better compete with the port wine that was also popular in England. And that's one style of sherry. But as I said before, there are many styles of sherry. And while that style was most of what was being exported to England, it wasn't necessarily what people were drinking back in Jerez. And it definitely wasn't what González's Tio Pepe was drinking. His sherry was fortified, but it wasn't oxidized. It had been aged under flor, which is a term for a yeast mat that grows on the aging sherry in its barrels. The flor contributes some unique flavors through what's called biologic aging, but importantly, it protects the wine from air. So where a typical sherry of the time was dark in color, Tio Pepe was very light, much more like a white wine. And it wasn't sweet either. This style of wine, called fino, is actually the driest wine there is, because the yeasts stay active during the aging period and convert any residual sugar to alcohol. My bottle doesn't say the word fino on it, but it has very dry sherry in big letters at the bottom. So when Robert Blake Byass imported the first barrels of this wine to England, it made quite an impression due to its unusual light color and taste. It was much more like a regular white wine than a heavy oxidized sherry, and that's how it would go on to be marketed. Tio Pepe found fans throughout Europe and the United States and would become one of Spain's most beloved and important brands. In 1935, the head of advertising introduced their now famous logo. It featured a bottle of Tio Pepe dressed up in a red jacket and a wide-brimmed hat and carrying a Spanish guitar. The iconic design became a familiar sight on billboards and in newspapers and advertisements. A neon sign featuring the logo and the words Tio Pepe was mounted on a hotel in Madrid and became a symbol of the Puerta del Sol neighborhood of the city. When the hotel was set to be replaced by an Apple store in 2012, the entire city of Madrid was outraged that the sign was removed. Fortunately, in 2014, it found a new home on the roof of another building nearby. That logo turned out to be the key to figuring out the age of my tiny bottle of Tio Pepe. The company's website has a very handy page showing the changes to the logo and the bottle label through the decades. My label most closely matches the one from 1979 to 1989, so that's my guess as to when it's from. There's also something that looks like it might be a 2-digit year code starting with 8 on the bottom of the bottle. That would be more reliable if I knew the bottle was American, but this one was definitely destined for Canada with both French and English on the label. So that puts this bottle at a minimum of 35 years old, possibly up to 45. Now, one of the special things about sherry is that the wines can spend a lot of time aging and get blended together in particular ways over the years. But all that aging is supposed to happen in the barrels. Fino wines, like mine, have the least amount of aging and are intended to be drunk pretty quickly after bottling, when they're fresh and light and unoxidized. You are absolutely not supposed to keep them around for 35 years, which is going to make this very interesting to taste. It might be completely undrinkable, or it might have transformed into something closer to a style of sherry called Amontillado, which is oxidized but not sweet. I have no idea, but I do have a great person to taste it with. Chantal Sang is a Washington, D.C. bartender and sherry expert, and she's agreed to join me in finding out what the heck's inside this one. Check out the next episode for that tasting, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it. And why not hit that like button while you're down there? I'd love to hear your thoughts on sherry. Leave a comment below or at mytinybottles.com or on social media. I'm at mytinybottles on Instagram and Facebook, and Tammy LC on Blue Sky. Check out my Patreon for bonus content, cocktail recipes, and more. Cheers!